Hey everyone. So, as a computational scientist, I end up dealing with a lot of data that is meaningful to me in a format that I like, but it's not very good to others. So, one of my projects that I'm on, I'm screening a database of a couple billion molecules and returning a list of a top 100 to a chemist colleague that so that he might go and experimentally test them. Now, this is the output as I get it as a scientist. I have the names of the molecules in string formats. I have a little bit of data about the molecule, and I can use this to get a sense for what the search is. And while this is meaningful to me, it isn't a great way of communicating the data to to others. So what I'm going to talk through today is a way of turning data into like this into an interactive visualization like the one I'm illustrating here, where, say, I can highlight specific molecules, see what they look like. I could say select a bunch and identify what the similarities between them are. So this would be a form that will be much more intuitive for another scientist to use. And we're going to talk through how to make that happen. The code that I pieced together to do this is built primarily on top of a tool called Bokeh, which makes an interactive visualization, and RDKit, which is a toolkit for manipulating molecule data. And the way it roughly works is like this. So let's give us a blank slate to work from and go up to the top. Standard things, I'm going to import my data from this CSV file that was meaningful to me, and I'm going to create the names of two output files based on that. So here it's a CSV file, so I'm going to load it in via pandas. I'm going to do some basic manipulations on it. I'm going to rename columns from something very dense, like this to me tells me I computed this ionization potential with a normal basis set in acetonitrile based on geometries produced with a small basis set. That's really helpful to me, not so much to anyone else. So I'm going to convert it to a simple name like redox, that when I save it to a disk later, someone will be able to intuitively see what that means. Then I'm going to do a little bit of calculations. I compute things in absolute voltages. My colleague prefers them in relative, so I'm going to do that conversion. And then comes the interesting part. So this first function I have here takes that molecule string and converts it to a scalar vector graphic, or SVG. This SVG I'm going to use later to be able to print the molecule inside of an HTML document. And what it's doing here with our dkit is it's reading in the molecule, it's computing coordinates to put them in 2D, then it's taking the molecule graph and those coordinates and rendering it to this SVG object. More about that in a moment. Now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and use it to make a plot. So here I'm loading in a object file using Bokeh. This is pretty standard Bokeh stuff. I'm telling it that when I finish this graph, I want to write it to a file and print it out to my notebook. Going through here, I'm going to assign a color to each point, whether they're Pareto optimal or not. It's going to change the color between two different hex patterns. I'm then going to make a tooltip like I showed you earlier. So that I'm using with Bokeh's tool. And what I do here is I define HTML for what that tooltip look like. Now, the first thing you'll see is that I'm going to take a field named SVG. I know it's a field because it has an ampersand. That means Bokeh is going to paste in the value of that data point to this spot. And I'm telling Bokeh that this is going to be HTML, but I trust it. That's what safe means. Then I'm going to print out the smile string and the redox potential and the solvation energy. And here I've got some additional formatting to tell me how many digits I want. Once I've got that hover tool, I'm also going to define the data source. You'll see here I'm taking my pandas data frame and I'm only grabbing a few columns from it, the ones that I need to plot and the ones that are going to appear in that tooltip. I then make my plot. So here I'm using just a standard figure where I've labeled the axes. I've made it 1200 by 800 so it'll look good on a normal browser. And I plot down my points using that results view. I then do another thing. I'm going to query my results again to find which of those points are on the Pareto surface, and I'm going to make a step. So that we're going to show you what its result looks like since we've just stepped through a few things. Let's refresh this page. You can see here, these are my points that I got during the point segment. You can see I've got colors for points that are along this so-called Pareto surface that are better than any other point in these combinations of two properties. And you can see my hover tool. When I hover over, you can see that it renders that SVG, that ionization potential with only 1 degree, or only 1 point after the decimal. The last thing I did in this particular notebook is I built in the select tool. So you can see when I select a series of points, what it does is it populates a table in order to render them all out in a point that I can see and copy that smile string so I can go search it on the internet. So I can see, well, this isn't it, but if I go to kimspider.com, awesome website, by the way, that if I say copy this and paste it here, I can get the actual chemical name, I can find the vendor of who will sell it to me. Well, it looks like this one isn't sold, so it might not be a good candidate for us to consider for our studies, but that's okay. So the way that I make the select object is I add two different things to the plot. The first is a div, which is just a section of HTML code that's going to hold my results. And initially, it's going to give instructions. So I fill in its text field to say instructions. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in some JavaScript that will change that div when I highlight objects. So this is going to be a little bit weird. I'm defining JavaScript inside a Python code, but bear with me for a moment. So the first thing I do is I follow the results view, and I'll post to the documentation on where I learned this from Boca. But what it does is I first define the two different objects that I'm going to be using to define what I'm changing when I select points. So here it says when the selected points change, I call this JavaScript, and that JavaScript looks a little bit like this. I'm not going to go over it in great detail, but you can see here I'm getting the indices of where I got my data from. I'm going to keep my instructions in the file, but then I'm going to add in a table with a certain header, and I'm going to go over all of my selected points and paste them into the table. You can see here I'm pasting in my smile string, and I'm pasting in my scalar vector graphic version of the molecule so that it will render in HTML. And once I define this and render it out, I now have my nice plot. Not sure what that's all about, but it's got all of my interactivity that I wanted. All right, so that's one form. The other form of the data I wanted to send was Excel, because Excel is most scientists' favorite tools. And here I wanted something that looks a little bit like this, where I have my smile string, I've got some basic details about the molecule and its properties. And I wanted it in a spreadsheet so I could do everything I wanted, like be able to sort molecular weights. Let's say I just drop off the first three, and I'll get rid of these very small molecules. So how do I do that? You might realize that writing an Excel document is very easy. I've already got pandas used in this notebook, so I'm just going to write out my notebook to or write out my pandas data frame to an Excel document using pandas. But I'm going to have to do some special things to make it work with the images appeared in. So here I'm actually using a tool called Excel Writer, which is integrated into pandas, and it has some nice instructions on how you can be able to do some more complicated manipulations of a spreadsheet using XLSX Writer along with pandas. And so I'm going to do that here. First, going to make a utility function. This here, instead of writing my molecule to a SVG output, I'm going to write it to a PNG. I do a little bit of trickery here. I give RDKit a bytes.io object to write from, which means it's going to write the data into a buffer instead of actually to a file, which that's going to make things a lot easier. So here I've created the set of columns that I want to save in my spreadsheet. I'm going to create a new column that will store the images. Now I'm going to go through and write these columns and my images to that spreadsheet. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the old one. I'm going to have to close it so Excel won't prevent me from writing to that file. So I got rid of it. Now, following those instructions from this web page I showed you, I'm going to open a Excel writer tool with pandas. I'm going to use it to write most of the columns of the spreadsheet to disk. Then I'm going to go through and write every image. So this here, I have to do some additional trickery with the Excel writer tool. I am telling it to insert an image at each space, at each cell. I know that my cells start at F2 for the images. If we opened up that spreadsheet again, you'd see that column F is my images, row 2 is the first molecule. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over all of my molecules, and I'm going to convert them to an image using that image data tool. This returns a buffer, which XLSX writer will know how to write into the Excel document. And if I loop over these enough times, additionally, I'm going to make the column wide enough that it'll save my full image. Here I complete the write. It's now going to have a Excel or a rendered version of each molecule here. And because it's embedded inside of the cell, I can do things like sort, and it's going to sort my molecule strings accordingly. So now I've gone from data, just to recap, in a file format that's only its mother could love, into something that I could send my colleagues and they would be able to work with without kind of having me to talk them through every step of the way, which means we can all work together as a team most efficiently. So check down in the links to this into the document. I'll post you to where this notebook is held on GitHub, and a few of the key documentation bits from Boca and XLSX Writer that I use to make this happen. And thanks for tuning in.